make the effort of considering Europe as a space power, which still needs to be demonstrated, but still you will see that we are not in a super good position in comparison to the ambition of other ones. That's perhaps the negative aspect of this conference today. Perhaps a more positive aspect is the extremely positive contribution of the space industry to the European commercial balance, where you will see that we contribute a lot to this to the positive commercial balance, showing that European space industry is still very much competitive, which is a good news. The other reason why I think it's important to spend some time on economic figures, it's also we are now nearly on a daily basis discovering new economic analysis, especially in the non-specialized press, where there is this growing tendency of confusing revenues with investment with turnover, and not knowing exactly where space begins and where the space sector ends. So this will be our contribution today to this reflection. And so I will give the floor to Pierre for the presentation of the results of this economic study. And of course, do not hesitate to interrupt Pierre to ask your question, but I will give the floor to Pierre immediately. So thank you very much. And I also take this opportunity to congratulate my team and Pierre in particular for this enormous work that has been made possible thanks to the effort of the team, but also thanks to the contribution of the European space industries. So not only Eurospace members, but all the others who have contributed. So thank you, and Pierre, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Olivier, for the introduction. Thank you for all who have joined today. I hope that the microphone is working well. I am very pleased to see so many people in attendance. And so I am eager to present to you this year a few economic highlights for the European space sector in 2020. So we do this presentation in the context of the issuing of our Facts and Figures annual report. So let me put the presentation in full screen for some reason. Okay, my computer has decided to use the other screen. Okay, that's a bit disturbing for me, but it's okay. The Facts and Figures is the annual report we publish every year, and which is based on a survey which is performed to measure the economic situation of the European space manufacturing industry in Europe. The Eurospace Facts and Figures exists as a report with a stabilized survey since 1996, and it builds on data that was gathered previously via a contract that was placed by the CNES and ESA in alternance with Eurospace that was measuring the workload of industry. So we built up on that one, we stabilized the methodology, we involved Eurospace members, and we extended the reach to any company in Europe willing to participate to the survey. And since 1996, we create this report, which is published every year. It is distributed for free to European institutions, and it is provided also for free to the companies that actually support the survey. So it's a synergetic effort. The report exists because companies complete the survey, which has evolved in time. It is now a very complex and complete survey tracking the revenues of industry. And of course, the added value for them is that thanks to their participation in the survey, they are able to use the report to benchmark their performance, to benchmark how well they are doing with regard to the evolution of the global accessible market to the European space industry. Very important to understand, I am going to present in introduction a few figures which are not related directly to the survey to put the European industry in the global context so that we know how this industry is faring regarding the other space powers in the world, notably the USA, China, Russia, Japan, and India. And in the second part of the presentation, I will unveil the first key data sets that have been produced by Eurospace on the basis of the annual survey. Of course, big spoiler already now, we have registered this year a drop of sales which is worth 1 billion euro compared to 2019. That is a 13% reduction in sales this year. It's a unique situation. It has never happened before since the figures exist since 1991. So this is the major fact of the year. And another point very important before we understand, this survey is focusing on measuring the activity related to the design, development of space systems, which include spacecraft, satellites, sounding tugs, whatever is flying in actual orbit, and the production of the launch systems that are used to launch those satellites in orbit. The survey is an economic survey which respects a number of usual statistical feats. So it measures the revenues generated by sales of those systems. It includes also a measure of service revenue associated to that work, which is basically the business of providing engineering studies and support activities, mostly to the industry in development and management phases of the programs, but also to the agencies. We have a number of outside contractors that are working on site in ESTEC, for instance. The companies providing those services to ESA, but also to industry, are included in the survey, and you will see that they are tracked precisely in the report under the ground segment activities. So, well, this longish introduction, one last point is that if you are a European institution or if you are a member of the press, you will be receiving the report by the end of the day. This full report is copyright protected. It can be quoted by the press. It can be used to make specific analysis, but it cannot be reproduced publicly outside the press, and it should not be used to support further analysis without our notice. So I am available to discuss copyright licensing of the figures and the charts. It happens regularly. We do it in a regular basis, but this is not free to publish. So if you receive the report, please do not distribute it around you. This would be a copyright breach. Thank you very much for your attention. Let's move now to the global context. In this chart, we present a measure of global space activities since 1980. So we have 40 years of space activities, and we have split the mass launched every year by customer segment. We separate the mass put in space, so this is spacecraft launched every year, depending on who was paying for that. In red, you see those are the satellites launched on behalf of public money. Every time it is a government paying, we put this mass in red. And we have also private driven space activities. And we see that private activities in space started very slow in the 80s, and they really began growing in a significant way at the end of the 90s. We have seen, however, that since private commercial space developed, it didn't really boom until 2020. So the year 2020 is the year of the big change. This is what I call the Starlink impact. In 2020, commercial space grew significantly. There were 200 tons more launched in 2020 on behalf of private initiative than all the years before. This is changing the scale of space activities in terms of commercial appreciation. But I wouldn't call this a trend, since today it is a single point, okay? Those 200 tons are all related to Starlink. The activity, commercial activity, which is associated to businesses such as the Planet, Spire, ICEYE, Black Sky, etc., they generate a lot of demand. Sometimes they deploy large numbers of satellites, but the volume of activity remains very, very small in terms of total satellite mass. This is also a trend that we must recognize. There is today a larger number of very small satellites which are launched, but still they don't have a very strong economic impact on the industry, because we have noted something which is very important to clarify. There is a correlation between the satellite mass and the satellite cost. Small satellites cost much less. So this indication in mass is also a good indication of the volume of business. Also, this is highly relevant for launch activities, because launch activity are measured by the volume launched. So the less we launch in mass, the less revenue will be available for launchers worldwide. So this is a major trend. In 2020, the major increase of private initiative. On the other hand, we see that the activity associated to governments has not really grown, and it remained quite stable in the past 15 years. Let's have a look now at the 5 last years, and we measure with these two charts the output of the space industry in all the major space powers. So you see in blue here on the left side, this is the total spacecraft mass produced by Chinese entities between 2016 and 2020. And here you can see on the right side, this is the total mass which has been launched, you see, in 2020 by Chinese launchers. So to be very clear, here we measure the spacecraft output in tons on the left side, and we measure launcher capacity based on launcher production region. So for instance, every launch performed by the Soyuz from Kourou will be counted in the gray histograms, because it is a Russian-built launcher, which is actually putting the mass in orbit. So what are those charts telling us? First, they're telling us, again, 2020 was an exceptional year. Starting 200 tons, which actually impact the last year in a very significant way from the spacecraft manufacturing perspective and from the launcher manufacturing perspective. With Starlink, with SpaceX, basically, the US are taking a major advance over all the other players in terms of spacecraft and launcher capacity. It is a unique situation. It has never happened before. So we are very curious to see how this will develop. On the other side, we also see that we have a ranking in the space powers. They are not all the same size. The industrial output is very different. If you look at the total output of the Indian entities here, it is below 10 tons, more or less, every year. If you look at the situation with China, you see that for China, we have a growth trend. We see that Chinese entities are outputting more and more spacecraft every year, and Chinese launchers are launching a growing quantity of spacecraft every year. So this is another major trend. So we have also this ranking of space powers, and clearly today we have a big message. If we put together the capacity of all those space powers, where clearly the United States now are jumping ahead of everyone. They are closely followed by China, which is still way beyond, but we will look later on that the Chinese institutional effort is probably matching the one from the USA. Then we have Russia, which is still a major player in space, although it has a lower capacity and not a very good one in terms of spacecraft production. But Russian launchers remain very strong players in the market. And then we have contenders for the 4th place between Europe and Japan. I must say that if we use the mass indicator, of course, Japan will win in terms of spacecraft production, because the Japanese are still involved in producing spacecraft for cargo deliveries to the space stations. Those spacecraft are among the largest and most, the highest weight for spacecraft in the global space application domain. So clearly, every time there is an HTV which is launched, it has a big mass impact, more than 20 tons on the global statistics, while in Europe, when we launch one Galileo, it's only 700 kilograms. So the mass indicator, of course, depending on the application we consider, is not always a perfect indicator of output capacity and price. But still we see that Europe and Japan are way, way, way behind the capabilities which are available in Russia and in China, and of course, in the United States. And one of the main reasons for that is the difference in institutional programs. In this chart, we present for the years 2016 and 2020, the total mass of spacecraft produced on behalf of institutional programs. And on the right-hand side, the same mass distributed by launcher, which has been used to put them in orbit. Here you clearly see a very specific context. The Chinese space sector, the Russian space sector, the American space sector, they all benefit from an activity volume which is 5, 6, 7, 8 times bigger than the one for the European sector. So clearly we have a unique situation where we are competing with countries, with companies which are producing much larger volumes globally of activity on behalf of their government. Here, we don't see any impact of the commercial market. So clearly you see that this government investment creates unique opportunities to develop and invest for the Russian, the Chinese, and the US industry. And this is a reality which is measured on spacecraft production and which is also flowing down on the launcher approach. The additional problem we have in Europe, if you look here, is that when European institutions are buying launchers, well, they don't always buy European launchers in orange. In the past 5 years, only half the mass of institutional programs, European institutional programs, was actually launched by European launchers. The other half was launched by Russian launchers. The fact that those Russian launchers are operated in Kourou most of the time, but not always, is of course mildly satisfying. We would very much prefer to have all this market available to actually have more launch opportunities for Vega and for Ariane 5, of course, and in the future Ariane 6. So this is a distressing point. We have a very small institutional domestic market in Europe compared to the other space powers in the world. And here I must make a friendly nod to Commissioner Breton, who keeps stating that Europe is number 2 in space. I think that we need to review the metrics altogether to understand what we're talking about, because in our assessment, Europe at best is number 4. And when we look at institutional programs, clearly we are lagging behind. Fortunately, the European industry has managed to gather excellent performance on competitive markets. In those charts, you see the current output of those industrial sectors, Chinese, European, Indian, etc., in terms of spacecraft production and in terms of launcher capacity, split between the amount of mass which was produced on behalf of their domestic institutional market, the one we usually call the captive demand, okay, and how much of that mass is actually produced on behalf of competitive commercial and export markets. And there you see already that we have 2 major differences in terms of access to those markets. We see that the Russians, the Chinese, the Japanese, the Indians, basically they have an industry which is almost living off exclusively from its domestic institutional market. On the other hand, the USA and Europe are also contenders for the commercial activity, the one that was shown in blue at the beginning of the presentation in the global access. Here you see that Europe and the USA are almost the only players for the export and the commercial market. And we also see here very strongly on the US side, the Starlink impact. We have almost 550 tons of spacecraft produced in 5 years by the USA, but from those 550, 200 were just the last year. It's Starlink. It's a very specific captive market that SpaceX has created for itself. On the other hand, we see that Europe, and to a lesser extent the USA now, is the only industrial sector in the world where the global output for spacecraft measured in mass and the global launch activity measured in mass at launch is actually bigger on the commercial and export market, and as I say, much bigger than that, than the activity provided in terms of the domestic institutional business, the captive market, the market from those institutions such as ESA, the EU, CNES, the DLR, the Ministries of Defense, and so on. But be aware of another major point, which is not actually evident from this kind of presentation, is that the actual value of satellites on the commercial market is much, much, much lower than the value of satellites on the institutional market. So clearly, when you look at those schemes, you look at output, capacity, effort, production capability. You shouldn't translate that in revenues, because in revenues, and we will see that when we look at the Eurospace figures, you will see, for instance, that for Europe, the amounts generated by the domestic market is actually more or less the double than the one generated on the commercial market. So there is a production capability that we measure. We must take into account the fact that commercial and export markets are much, much lower in value than the domestic institutional market. And then we must highlight one very important point, is that, as you well know, the domestic institutional market are only open to local competition. So in Europe, we compete within Europe for European institutional budgets, and in America, they compete between American companies for those American institutional business. So there is very much international trade on those specific markets. So I said that the European budget is quite small. How small is it? Well, not that small. If you start looking at the details, we're pretty proud to see that in Europe, we have a budget which, from the Eurospace assessment, consolidated and looking exclusively at the amounts which are actually funding infrastructure. So for instance, we don't count here the parts which is available from the union perspective to develop market activities for Galileo and Copernicus, for instance, but this is not a very big amount. Well, the total budget in Europe for space infrastructure production development is in the order of 10 billion euro, actually in growth from the previous year. We split this budget from 2 points of view. On one hand, we look at who is actually funding those amounts, and we see that basically we have two major dynamics in Europe. We have national space budgets, which are used to fund the ESA mandatory and optional programs, and which are also used to develop and fund local markets, local institutional programs in the civil and military domains. So this is the national space budgets. Those are budgets which are decided at national level to be flagged towards space programs, and then there are channels towards ESA and national programs. And then we have the EU. For the EU, the dynamic is different because the EU is leveraging a budget from its member states, which is actually based on GDP and VAT. So it's a budget which is generated without having a budget allocation in mind. And then there is a dynamic process within the European Union to allocate the budget to all the union policies, which include a large amount, which is then flagged towards space programs, which represented 1.7 billion in 2020. So those are the two main dynamics for budget leverage. There is the European Union with its own political context, which is able to generate budget for space programs. This, we know that we have the multi-annual financial framework, which is paid for that. And then we have the national space budget dynamic. And then we need to look how this budget is actually managed, because this is a very typical European complexity. We have two main budget sources, but actually when you look at the national space budgets here, we have indeed 22 different sources. And those are actually versed into mostly ESA. The European Space Agency is managing, from a contractual and technical point of view, 60% of the total European space budget. It is using the money provided by the member states for the mandatory and the optional programs. It is, of course, also funded by the European Union through the delegation agreements for the implementation of the Galileo and Copernicus programs, and then growingly also for some areas of Horizon 2020, and then in the future for other activities. This is managed by the framework agreement between ESA and the EU. Then we have the budget, which is managed by national entities to pursue their civil programs. This represents more or less 23% of the total, okay, 2.3 billion. Then we have the budget managed at national level to pursue military programs. And when we look at those national programs, which represent altogether almost 4 billion euro in 2020, actually we see that these are only relevant to very few countries in Europe. Actually, when you look at the actual amount of those national programs, well, most of that is found in France, Germany, Italy, the UK, and to a lesser extent, Spain. So those are the ones which are pursuing significant investment in national programs. Then, of course, you have some level of budget which is managed by EUMETSAT, which, as you know, is operating a large satellite infrastructure for meteorological services. But most of the budget available for EUMETSAT for developing and launching the EUMETSAT satellite is actually managed by ESA. And then the remaining amount, 200 million, is actually what's left of the 1.7 billion that the EU has available for space programs, which is not delegated to ESA. So this involves some ground segment development for Galileo mostly, and some activities relevant to the framework program for research and innovation, also the ones which are not delegated by ESA. So you see here that ESA is the main driving force for European space programs from a contractual perspective and a technical management entity. So ESA, as you will see then later on, is a very big player in the industrial activity. And keep in mind this figure of 10 billion, because then we will compare that with what is actually available in terms of industry revenues from this total budget of 10 billion. Let's have a look at the European space industry sales. So now we look at the data which is collected by the Eurospace Facts and Figures Survey. So this data is unique, it's not in the public domain. And we are very happy to be able to produce such a significant research every year, thanks to the support of our members, of other companies in the sector. Again, it's not limited to Eurospace membership, it is a complete economic model aiming at measuring the totality of space activity. And of course, the effort of Eurospace members is very much welcome because it is paying for the work that we are doing to produce those statistics every year. So we see here a situation, we have 30 years of consolidated statistics, which is a very unique in terms of industrial sectors worldwide. You don't see this for all sectors. And we see a trend in sales. So the orange or red histograms represent the value of sales every year. So a few points, in 30 years, the business has almost tripled from the industry. We were slightly above 3 billion. We were almost at 9 billion in 2019. So it is a sector in growth, and we will see what are the dynamics of that growth. This growth has a cyclical component. I will explain later on what is driving this seeming cycle. And this growth in activity has been supported by constant growth in employment. This year, we achieved for the first time the symbolic value of 50,000 direct employees for the space industrial sector in Europe. And despite the fact that the business had registered a very big drop between 2019 and 2020, we still see employment in growth. I must say, however, that this employment growth is actually fueled by diverging trends. We see that in the very big players, the larger group in space, we have seen employment reduction in 2020 compared to 2019. On the other hand, we have seen players from the smaller companies, including the emerging players in the new space, having grown significantly last year compared to 2020. So those are the ones which have fueled the global growth. They have more than compensated the employment reduction within the large players, and also the activity and the employment in the mid-caps has also grown. So let's have a look at the industry employment by country. As I said before, in Europe, all countries are not equal. Some are investing much more in space than others. And as a result, well, accumulated efforts, years and years, decades and decades, create massive local industrial capacities as a result. So in this chart, you can see the difference in terms of industrial employment between the various European countries. We are very happy because now we are growing the number of countries that we include in the survey. For instance, we have recently included Romania, not only because our members, such as CEDER and GMV, are actually working in Romania, are expanding their activities there, but also because we are registering interest from new space players, which we include in our survey, such as, well, the not so well known and not so successful so far ARCA company, which is actually producing those new green launchers. You can see also other countries which are emerging, Poland, which is expected to become a major player, also because a lot of large industries are actually branching out to Poland to develop, and also because there is a growing new space segment in Poland with, I don't know, I want to mention the KP Labs, for instance. We also have institutes working there, ASD-Eurospace. So clearly there is activity there. We also have activity growing in very, very small countries. And this is thanks to the new space and SME environment. On the other hand, when you start looking at the charts, you will see that clearly the main drivers for employment are provided by larger companies, not SMEs. Large groups, mid-caps are actually what any country should actually aim at if it wants to develop in full its segment. So SMEs must grow out and not be SMEs anymore. You don't want to have a space sector locally composed exclusively of SMEs because it will not be solid enough and it will not reflect the future growth. So if you want to have growth, you must expect your SME to become mid-caps, and then why not large groups. Here you see France, Germany, Italy, Spain, the UK, to a lesser extent, Belgium and the Netherlands. They're clearly the major players in space. But as you can see, France with almost 18,000 people working in space, compared to Germany with 10,000, a bit more, compared to Italy, almost 6,000, the UK, Spain, 4,000 to 5,000. Clearly, we have major differences in efforts. So this is also due to the fact that despite the fact that if you compare, for instance, the contribution of France and Germany to the ESA budget, if you compare the national budget of France and Germany, they are more or less of the same size. Still, not having made the same choices, we see that France also has developed an industry which is participating much more than the German industry to the commercial market, which creates other business and employment opportunities. We also provide, so the global split, you see that totally speaking, large groups, which are companies which have more than 10,000 global employees, represent 65% of space employment in Europe. The mid-caps, which are companies which at global level represent less than 10,000 employees, they provide 25% of total employment, and SMEs, in our assessment, about 10%. And clearly, with the new space effort, those SMEs are growing. With that regard, I would like to make one important statement. SME is not only a small company, it's also a small company which has small capital. As soon as those new space SMEs manage to leverage capital, which creates a balance asset value, which is in excess of 43 million, it's not an SME anymore. So this is very important to keep in mind because we are seeing a growing wave of equity in the new space environment, which means that a lot of SMEs last year are not SMEs anymore this year. Not because they have more than 250 employees, some are in the order of 100, but because, like ASD-Eurospace, for instance, they have equity in excess of 43 million. So it's important to keep in mind also with regard to the SME policy and how it works. Everybody thinks that the SME policy is actually addressing small companies that actually need help. Well, no, it's addressing small companies with small capital that may actually need help. And if you look at the situation in places like Austria, Austria doesn't have a very significant SME population, but all the space units in Austria are actually quite small companies. So you see, this is very important because sometimes as an economist and observer of the space industry, I have the impression that the SME policies are actually put in place without a very strong understanding of what is actually expected from those policies outcome, and without even a very strong understanding of what is the reality of the SME environment in the space sector in Europe. So I invite people to actually have a closer look at those. We publish in the report the full list of companies, and you will see how many SMEs you have in your country. You will be able to check. It's a 500 company list that we publish in the report. So let's have a look now at the business trends over 30 years for the two main segmentations we provide in the survey. In the survey, we are able to separate revenues according to the type of system which is produced. This is what you see on the left side. And according to the main customers, this is what you see on the right side. And regarding the systems, we have 5 meta categories, actually 4 plus 1 for unknown and unclassified activities. The biggest revenue point and the one which has generated more growth in industry in the past 30 years is what we define as satellite application systems. So what are satellite applications in our definition? Basically, they include every system which is produced with a telecommunication mission, with an Earth observation mission, including Earth science, we're not limited to operational ones, including meteorology, and all activities relevant to position, navigation, and timing. So the CLS Argos payloads, but also, of course, also the EGNOS activities, and of course, in Europe, the major Galileo program, all are falling in that category. The satellite applications exhibit a cyclical type of growth because if you look at the 3 components that we have in this curve, one very big one for the European industry is the telecommunications segment. As I said at the beginning, we are strong in exporting satellite systems. We are strong on the commercial market for satellite systems. Well, this commercial market is almost single-handedly composed of telecommunication systems. It was the case in the past. It will be the case in the future. We have, of course, a number of exports in Earth observation systems, but those are very limited in value if you compare them to the global impact of telecommunication systems. In average, every year in the past 10 years, the European space industry has sold 2 billion worth of communication satellites worldwide, commercial ones. And in contrast, Earth observation systems, they represent between 150 and 200 million a year in sales. So clearly not the same amount. It's interesting because there are almost all export sales for observation systems, but still we don't expect this market to actually provide a lot of growth in the future, on the contrary. And this market for geostationary telecommunication systems is the one which has created this cyclical impact on satellite application sales because there is a more or less 10 to 15 years cycle in procurement for geostationary telecommunication systems. When we look at recent years, you see here that we have achieved a very high figure of almost 5 billion euros. So 2 billion of those are actually communication systems. So what is the rest? Well, the rest is the Earth observation systems, mostly the Copernicus and other Earth observation efforts, including in the military, produced for institutional programs. So basically we see that commercial business is mostly telecom with private funding, and Earth observation business is mostly institutional, okay? And we have a lot of systems which are produced in that array. We have the Sentinels, we have the meteorological systems, we have tactical observation in radar, in optical. This is creating additional opportunities within the order of a few billion euro every year. And then, of course, we have the navigation program. You will be able to review all the details of how those values evolve point by point, line by line in the report, because we have all the detailed graphs and charts for those. The second point in revenue is actually associated to launcher programs. So basically the European industry is producing launcher systems, and it has basically 2 drivers for this activity. One driver is the activity for development, consolidation, and support provided mostly through the ESA programs. Ariane 5 development, Ariane 6 development, Vega E, Vega C, MCO, ARTA, VERTA, LEAP, EGAS, etc., etc., etc. So this is, depending on the year, representing between 30% and 60% of the total revenues generated in the launcher segment. The rest is associated to the sales of operational launch systems to the European launch operator, plus a few experts, but that don't represent huge amounts every year. We see that in the last year, we have registered a very big drop in launcher sales, as we had in satellite sales. And this, I will explain later on what were the dynamics. So launcher business is between 1 and 1.8 billion euro every year in the past 3 decades in industry. It's very stable. You see also that it has a slightly cyclical component, because you see that when there are more satellites to launch, well, there is more business in launch business. This is pretty logic, although you must keep in mind that all the satellites which are produced on behalf of the blue revenues that you see here are not necessarily launched by the European launchers, Ariane and Vega. So this is a general trend, mostly related to the evolutions of the commercial satellite trend, which again has a slightly cyclical component. Then we see the gray curve, which is one of the most exciting things we have seen so far, which is the growth of scientific systems. So this includes every scientific satellite produced on behalf of ESA and national programs. And here we look mostly at astronomy efforts and everything which is related to the development of activities associated to the International Space Station. So the deliveries of the Columbus module, the cupola, the nodes, the MPLM business, all this is business produced by European companies on behalf of what we call scientific systems. So this includes, again, science program, human activities, and also now exploration. There is a lot of interest growing towards planetary exploration. We have had the Rosetta success. We are moving towards the moon. We are considering Mars. We are going to the Jupiter icy moons very soon. So clearly we have a strong interest, and this is the growth we registered in the past 15 years in this segment, which has more than doubled its size in terms of revenues for the industry. And then we have one last segment, which we call support activities, to maintain continuity with the original survey we made. But here we have a statistical discontinuity because we introduced a new methodology in 2009, and we started to count separately ground segments from the rest. And now most of the growth that we have registered in the past 10 years in this segment is associated to the accurate measure we have of ground segment activities, which include the work associated to producing the ground control systems, the work associated to producing the ground mission segment, the antennas for upload and download, etc. And all the activities, as I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, which are associated to provide engineering, support, test, EGSE, MGSE to the industry and the agencies in Europe. Still, we note that there is a correlation of the growth of the ground segment business and the growth of satellite and launcher and science business, because more activity for orbital deployments actually require more business from the ground segment perspective. So all those points are moving more or less in the same direction. Now let's have a look on the right side. And here you see the sales by the main customer segments. Here we produce again the main categories, which I showed at the beginning of the presentation when I was presenting statistics of satellite production and launcher capacity output in terms of mass. Here I put exactly the same categorization, so I separate between the European institutional segment. So this is the revenues generated to the business of the European public customers, ESA, the EU, EUMETSAT, but also in the first decade here until 2001, the public customers included Inmarsat, which was a public company then, Intelsat, which was a public company, not in Europe at the time, Eutelsat, okay? So the institutional Europe, the perimeter has changed a little bit with the privatization of those entities. This has not had a dramatic impact on the total. And then here I put together everything which is related in red to commercial and export markets, which includes every single expert of satellite systems, including equipment and so forth, and also all the activity related to the operational launcher segment. So you see a different split. And here you see that basically we have seen a growth trend. In the early 1991 to 2002, there was the big growth of the geo-commercial segment, which created a situation in 2001, 2002, where actually the revenues associated to the commercial programs were higher than the ones associated to the institutional programs. So a very unique situation, which hasn't repeated so far, also because we have seen at the end of 2007, 2008, a major growth in European institutional programs. We have seen a situation where indeed the conjunct efforts of EUMETSAT and the Union to actually roll out new systems and approaches have actually given more revenues and more work to the European space industry. So when we see the trend growing here since 2009 all the way to 2019, most of that trend has been actually fueled by the growth of those institutional programs in Europe, mostly navigation and Earth observation programs. So you see, regretfully, that both segments are actually showing a major drop. In 2020, this is clearly one major impact of the COVID health situation. So I'm going to detail that a little bit with the next slides, where I'm going to dig deeper into those segments. So let us have a look first at the European institutional segments. As I showed at the beginning of the slide, we have 5 main segments with European institutions. We have ESA in deep blue. So ESA has been single-handedly providing business opportunities to the European industry, and it has been the major space customer in Europe for a while now. In this chart, I am separating from the ESA activity, the activity which is related to the delegation from the EU programs and the delegation from the EUMETSAT program. So they are excluded. In reality, most of the business is actually managed by ESA, but in order to identify the revenue sources, I have made the split looking at the program impact. So we can actually separate between what is actually managed by ESA on behalf of the ESA programs and what is actually managed by ESA on behalf of the EU and on behalf of EUMETSAT. So ESA, with more than 2.5 billion euro of revenues in industry in the past 5 years, is the major customer for the industry by far. Again, the total business of the industry in 2020, I didn't say it loud, but it's 7.7 billion. So you see, ESA alone represents 1/3 of the total. Then we have, in 2020, the second customer segment is composed of the sum of national programs in yellow. This is the amounts associated to the programs managed mostly by CNES, CNES, ASI, and the DLR, to a lesser extent, the UKSA, and a little bit, we see a few little bit Spanish national activities, but not of the same intensity. Those represented in 2020, 1 billion euro of industry revenues. Then we have the EU-driven programs, mostly Galileo, EGNOS, Copernicus. They represented 600 million euro in 2020. And then we have the EUMETSAT and the military program. So the EUMETSAT program is actually quite small, in the order of 180 million. And the military program represent 500 million in 2020. So we see two very distressing figures here. Basically, we see a big drop in revenues from the ESA perspective. This is very strange because if you look at the budget figures, you see that the ESA budget in 2020 was bigger than the one in 2019. Also, despite the COVID crisis, ESA has registered high sales in 2020, high purchases, in 2020, higher than in 2019. So we have been discussing this with ESA, and we have actually understood that ESA has actually paid a lot of cash advances to the companies. But considering the fact that the programmatic milestones were not achieved, the invoices were not issued by industry accordingly. So clearly we have ESA, which has made a lot of efforts to provide cash continuity to industry in 2020. However, industry has registered sales, which are measured on the amount of invoiced produced in the year, lower sales in 2020. So this actually should be compensated in next years. So we registered 500 million of drop in ESA sales in 2020. We believe that those will be progressively compensated in 21 and 22, but maybe not in totality, because a part of that drop is also related to a number of setbacks and difficulties on mostly the launcher programs. And for those, the compensation will be happening only later when we have the Ariane 6 maiden flight. So that will be maybe not compensated as early as 21 and 22. So we should be careful monitoring the figures next year, because we may have this compensation effect, which will suggest a growth in ESA business that will actually be related to the, I would say, administrative and technical setback we had with the COVID crisis in 2020. We see exactly the same trend with the EU programs, because basically they've been managed by ESA, and so they reflect exactly the same technical and administrative problems that were registered for the ESA programs. And we see also that military programs registered a major drop. Unfortunately, for those, I don't have a specific explanation. I've been discussing with a few colleagues from industry, trying to understand if this was related to the COVID crisis as well, or if there was another reason, but it was impossible for us to find a sensible reason. And the main players in the military domain, they're not so eager to discuss with us as ESA was. Again, I would like to highlight the fact that ESA has been incredibly helpful in investigating this seeming inconsistency between the ESA registered purchases in growth and the industry registered sales in reduction. So globally speaking, one key point we should keep in mind is that industry revenues associated to institutional programs in 2020, they represented 5 billion in total, actually 4.9, okay, out of 7.7. So 2/3 of the European space industry business was related to European institutional programs. And again, if you remember the beginning of the presentation, where we were showing the amount of satellite mass that was produced on behalf of the institutional programs compared to the one that was produced on behalf of commercial programs, there was the other ratio effect. This, again, exemplifies the fact that we have a lot of R&D, a lot of research, a lot of validation, a lot of tests, a lot of phase 0, phase A, which actually creates more value integrated in the sales with regard to the total mass, which is eventually launched. Now let's have a look at the commercial satellite and ground segment market segments. So this is the pendant from the satellite perspective of the institutional business. Here we see globally that we have a market which is in the order of 1.6 billion euro in 2020. What is striking with this business, the commercial satellite business, is that its three components, well, two of them are actually showing decrease since a few years now. Only one, the gray histograms, is actually showing growth. So those segments are actually comparable one to the other, particularly the blue and the red. The blue represents the sales of complete end-to-end systems, so including the satellite and the ground segment, to commercial operators in Europe. So those basically are the sales of our industry, the payments associated to the programs of Eutelsat, of Inmarsat, but also of Hispasat and SES and a few other lesser satellite operators in Europe. So they represent a business which has a cyclical component, again, as often the case with GEO satellites, but this is also related to orders in batches. Those operators often buy satellites by 2 or 3, and so basically they create a bump in revenue and activity, and then they fall down, and then another bump when there is a new signature. We see in red the same type of business, but associated exclusively to export customers. So those are our experts to mostly the Middle East, Asia, and to a very lesser extent, Latin America, where actually the Americans are better than us in terms of market penetration. This is a business which has been growing significantly. Actually, in 2015 and 2016, we hit record sales on those market segments, but it is really precipitating quite fast. Again, this is also due to the fact that, well, when you sell one Arabsat, of course, it takes a while before you sell a second one. So those are big, sizable contracts. This bump was quite unique. Our friends in the industry have told us that, however, they're not too worried, and that in the end, they still have signed a lot of contracts in 2020. If you have followed the announcers of Thales and Airbus, both of them have been very satisfied with the fact that 2020 indeed is a low point in sales, but the order book is filling up. So we are considering the possibility to have a take-up in that business in the coming years. On the other hand, we see a rather stable business point here, which is the actual expert, not of complete satellite systems, but ground segments, parts of ground segments, antennas, etc., and also satellite equipment, payloads, amplifiers, batteries, solar arrays, etc. This is a very strong point for a number of European players, not only the big one, by the way. We have a number of SMEs and midcaps, which are actually very strong in exporting satellite equipment and satellite payloads and satellite ground segments. And this has shown even a growth in 2020 compared to 2019. It's one of the very few segments which has actually registered a growth in 2020. And this is due to the good performance of those equipment worldwide. It is also a kind of indication that probably the COVID impact in terms of industry activity slowdown was not as strong in other countries as it was in Europe in 2020. So this is something that we are eager to consider as well. Maybe the COVID impact was more severe in terms of industrial impact on the space sector in Europe than it was on other space sectors worldwide. So this is about the commercial satellite segment, and I'm nearing now the end of the presentation by showing you the very good measure of export we have in the past decade for the European space systems at large, because this is something that we have analyzed regularly at Eurospace level. And we have found that space systems that represent overall 23 billion worth of sales in the past decade, well, they have actually contributed strongly to the European trade balance. Actually, if you diminish the exports by the value of imports, because Europe is also the first importers of satellite systems and launch services worldwide, but still we have a positive trade balance for the space sector. This positive trade balance has generated a net trade surplus, which is worth 1.1 billion euro a year. I'm sorry, I missed the billion here, but it's 1.1 billion euro per year in average. And the split is, most of that comes from complete satellite systems, the one I was describing previously, worth 640 million euro a year. A big part of that is associated to launch services, which generate positive trade balance worth 300 million. And of course, those specific markets for equipment and subsystems, which actually generate 150 million euro a year. What is interesting to note is that we are also importing a lot. This is because, as I said at the beginning, we are often launching with the Russian launchers. So this is basically what it cost us in 10 years. We're also, and when I say we, it's a few European-based operators where they're actually buying satellites from the US. This is the case of Telenor in Norway. Most of the time, they're buying American. This is also sometimes the case for the Spanish operator. This is also, of course, the case very often for SES. So those European operators, which are buying non-European satellites, well, they are creating a situation where they make less business for the European industry, but also they have a strong impact, negative impact, on the export trade. And then we have the business of equipment. As I told you before, this is a strong market for the industry, which is exporting quite significantly payloads and satellite equipment, as I said, such as batteries, propulsion systems, tanks, and so on. But we're also importing a lot. And one of the particularities of those imports is that they're related to technological dependence. The reason why we are buying so much equipment and subsystem, it is because we don't have those in Europe with the same level of price and performance. So we are creating a dependent situation, which is costing us, in average, 300 million every year. So basically, we need also to improve our efforts towards reducing those imports. And the best way of doing that is actually creating more efficient R&D and more use of the developments we have in Europe for the European programs. So it's very important to keep an eye on that, because this is a very strategic segment. In terms of experts, it is one which is extremely stable. And this is also where the ITAR regulation is actually helping us to some extent, because the main areas where we are also able to export is because the Americans cannot. But if we want to step up our trade, we need to get rid of the ITAR limitation. So this is something also we need to keep in mind at this point. And then I am concluding my presentation with this very last slide, which is actually looking at the launcher segment market. So the launcher segment market, as I said at the beginning, is actually split between two main domains. The launcher industry has revenues from the development programs funded by the institutional entities in Europe, in blue on the top right chart. And then they have also revenues from the sale of operational systems. Today in Europe, we have one single launch operator. It's called ASD-Eurospace. And so most of the revenues there are generated from the sales to ASD-Eurospace. Of course, we also have a few exports. For instance, the European launcher industry is exporting fairings. This is one of the major achievements of RUAG, which is not only doing fairings, but they're doing fairings for US and Japanese launchers. And so those are actually accounting as exports for the part which is produced in Europe, because they're also now producing in the USA, and that part of the business is not counted in the figures here. And we also have a few experts for electronics, sensors, and propulsion equipment from the point of view of launchers. But still you see that there is a kind of balance between the blue and the red histograms year after year. You can see in 2016, the major revenue impact in blue of the launch of the Ariane 6 development program. And then we see the moving revenues from those development programs. And you see the sharp drop between 2019 and 2020 of the blue histogram, the one on the European institutional programs. This is what I was mentioning at the beginning. We are registering here technical and programmatic issues. As you know, Ariane 6 will be delayed, so this will create an issue. We also see a reduction of activity in terms of operational systems. This, we believe, is mostly due to the shutdown of Kourou for a few weeks, and the global slowdown of launch activity that we have registered. And so it associates to lower revenues in terms of launcher production. We also know that there was a launch failure from Vega. This has not directly affected these figures, but you know, the time it took to actually put Vega back to the launch pad will be influencing the figures next year from that perspective. So those are the revenues from the industry, which is actually building the launcher. But of course, we need to see what is actually the use which is made of that launcher. This is what is shown in the chart below. It is showing you the total mass launched by Ariane and Vega. This is a very good assessment of the capacity offered by those launchers. And it is split, again, by European institutional customers in blue and other customers, which are basically commercial and export customers. And then you see one of the unique features of the Ariane system, including Ariane and Vega, which is that most of its activity is driven by the commercial market. And as soon as the commercial market is actually not providing sufficient launch opportunity to those systems, well, the costs become unbearable and the situation becomes critical for the launch operators. So here it is interesting to note that there has been a major reduction of launcher-driven activity. If you look at the beginning of 2010, 11, 12, 13, we had quite a significant amount of business from the European institutions, but we are not creating today enough opportunities for the European launchers. Sometimes as an economist, I'm wondering what would the European launch system look like if instead of launching 3, 4, 5 tons a year on behalf of the combined efforts of ESA, EU, and national institutional programs, if it could launch 40, 50 tons a year for those programs, an amount which is only half of the one provided by the Chinese program. It is only 40% of the amount provided by the US programs. So if that was the case, I believe that the European launch system would be much more robust in terms of technical qualities, but also mechanically, and this is a true feat of usual launcher economics, it would be much less expensive to use. So the average cost of launch of the European launch system would be much lower for all customers if there was more accessible demand and more stable demand. So this concludes the presentation for the day. I said I would do it in 1 hour. Apparently it's the case. I am now moving to the open questions. So I'm stopping to share my presentation. So if you can kindly raise your hand before asking a question and putting on your camera if you want to speak, and I will be monitoring that. And so the floor is open. Thank you for your attention. We are very happy to have you there. So there is one question. Please, Pascal. We cannot hear you. Yes, we can. Thank you very much.
Can you hear me?
I do.
And can you see me?
I do. Thank you.
Okay, it's great. Hear me is the most important thing. Pascal Hansens for Agence Europe. A very simple question to begin. Did you already present these figures to Mr. Breton? And did he explain to you maybe why he always say that Europe is a second power in space? Is he using another way of calculating figures, for instance? That's my first question.
Yeah. I will answer politically speaking, no and no. I have not the chance to speak with Mr. Breton myself. I have answered a number of his tweets by showing those slides, the one actually on institutional programs, but there was no reaction from Mr. Breton or his cabinet. But I think it's important to keep the metrics consistent. And then I have a hint. I believe that the reason why Mr. Breton says that we are the number 2 space power in the world is because of the bad assessments which are usually made on global space budgets, which are actually putting a very low value for both the Chinese and the Russian budgets, because they're using market exchange rates and are not trying to build what they should build, if the economic analysis would be made correctly, which are purchasing power parities exchange rates, which for space programs would be very specific. If you look at what the Russian space program is actually able to buy in terms of launcher capacity, launch site development, spacecraft deployed, or the Chinese, clearly the Chinese program is launching a rover on the far side of the moon. It is launching a rover on Mars. It is launching 103 tons of spacecraft every year. Half of that is military. They have 8 operational launcher families. They have 3 launch sites plus 2 in development. They have an industry which is strong of 200,000 people. And we say we are above them. The analysts which produce the budget assessment, they say the Chinese budget is $8 billion I mean, this is completely disruptive in terms of logical thought. So that has been a concern for me for many, many years. It doesn't make sense to present the Chinese budget. People should say, China is not publishing any information on budget. So if you ask me what is the Chinese budget, my answer is, I don't know. Unless someone in the CIA, someone, I don't know, at the DGSE in France, has this kind of information and then wants to make it available to the public. But clearly, I think it's intellectually dishonest that those studies are actually available to the public without not even a footnote. So that has been a rant of mine for the past 20 years. So I'm complaining with these guys even directly in their face. Okay, so this is what we have today. I'm not naming the consulting companies, but I believe they know who they are, but they're not listening today, I guess. Thank you. We have a question from Peter de Selding. Hello, Peter.
Hello, good afternoon. Thank you. I have a couple, and just stop me when I've gone on too long. First is a clarification.
Do I need to take it?
I'll go one at a time.
Yes, thank you.
First, you vacillate. You talk about a lot of euros when the graphic is talking in dollars. So is the graphic, look at graphic 18, for example. That's mainly in dollars, and you're talking euros. So I don't care. Just give us one. Do we believe what the graphic says, and you just talking in euros because it's whatever? Or in fact, was the graphic wrong?
So no. This graphic is in dollars because all those experts usually are actually pursued in dollars. So we look at dollar intake and dollar output in terms of imports and exports. But all the other charts we are making are actually built in euro for the part which is relevant to the facts and figures. But of course, those one on experts are labeled in dollars because actually it's dollar input.
Fair enough. Okay, that clarifies that. Thank you. The second question is, I'm not sure how to calculate the effect of your calling Soyuz in French Guiana a foreign launcher, a non-European launcher. And a follow-on to that is Arianespace's biggest commercial contract ever is for a constellation mainly being launched from Russia.
Yes.
It will be managing those Soyuz. So how do you, that will be revenue to Arianespace. Just like in the Soyuz activity in Kourou is revenue to the French state, revenue to anybody working in a launch pad and Arianespace. How do you just call that a foreign thing, or do you at least give part of the revenue credit?
The fact is that, so this is a very easy answer for me because the point behind that is the following. Here I am measuring the production of the launcher and the revenue associated to producing the launcher. And when I look at the launch statistics, I am looking at the revenue which is generated by using Ariane 5 and Vega to launch foreign satellites. So you see, this is how it's flowing down. So the revenue of Arianespace is completely another story because in this survey, Arianespace is a customer. Also, I would like you to think about the other point. If Arianespace is using Soyuz in Kourou, the first thing they have to do is to buy the Soyuz and import it in Kourou. So the cost of using Soyuz in Kourou has to be considered from the imports point of view. And this is what actually I was showing also in my slide 18. In the slide 18, where I'm showing import and exports, maybe you can share it again. In the slide 18, I'm actually showing, is it sharing? It's take a while to refresh. In the slide 18, I am actually showing the value of imports for launch services, and most of the value of launcher imports associated to launching European programs is actually relevant to the imports of Soyuz in Kourou. You cannot imagine that those Soyuz are provided for free by the Russian industry. So in terms of trade balance, yes, there is a net profit, hopefully for Arianespace, of buying this and then selling the service. But in the end, my impression is that most of the value generated from the sale of the service is actually going to the Russian industry in the end because they are providing the launcher. On the contrary, when Arianespace is actually operating Ariane 5 or Vega, well, they make a profit, hopefully, by selling the service, compared to what they are paying the launcher segments and the launcher integration. But in the end, most of the value from the service is going to the European industry. The Eurospace facts and figures is centered on European manufacturing capabilities. So this is why we may have maybe this problem of actually understanding the dynamics.
Yeah, it's not obvious to understand that. A related question, you know, the Airbus has a 50% share of a satellite manufacturing facility in Florida, which is building the 700 or so OneWeb satellites. How are you going to treat that?
We don't. The point principle is that in our survey, we only count the revenues which are associated to activities performed on European territory. So we call Europe the extended amount of ESA plus EU member states. All revenues generated outside, and I was mentioning at some point in the presentation the fact that RUAG is now building some fairings actually close to ULA in the United States. That revenue is not counted in our statistics. It exists, it's good for RUAG to have that business, but it's not European space industry revenue from the European production of space systems. It is excluded. The methodology is very clear from that. So we don't have that assessment.
Fair enough. Okay. Speaking of RUAG, you mentioned the COVID effects on the launcher activity in French Guiana for a couple of months. And you mentioned the Vega failure, which also delayed that vehicle. But you didn't mention that the Ariane 5...
Vega failure was in November. It didn't delay much.
Right.
And yes, there was an Ariane 5 issue, technical issue. But again, from my talks with the people in Ariane, this is not what has actually disrupted the activity in Kourou. The Kourou shutdown was a major reason why there was this big slowdown of activity. Also, if you have looked at the details, you've seen when they made the Vega campaign, the time it took for the people just to become operational on site due to the quarantine, etc. So this Ariane problem, which actually I didn't mention, but was not as striking as the VV17. Yes, it indeed, but it didn't have an impact on our figures this far.
Okay, I mean, it's Ariane 5 was on the ground for 11 months because of this problem. You take away a couple of months, 3 months, whatever you want for COVID, you've still got a net difference of multiple months it was down because of a design issue on a fairing. You don't expect that you say that's got a negligible effect in 2020. Okay, in 2021 too?
I am not presenting figures for 2021.
Okay, fair enough. All right. And a last one, you mentioned, Pierre, in the beginning, why you are so focused on tonnage, okay? And I know for launchers that makes a big difference, okay? More tons is more money, and there's a pretty much a one-to-one correlation there. But for satellites, the trend in satellites has been you get more performance per kilogram now than you did 10 years ago. So the value of that satellite is, at least in some way, not at all affected by its being a lighter satellite. Electric propulsion, other technologies, microtechnology, microelectronics advances have made it so that a 5-ton satellite today is no more powerful in what it can do for the customer than a 3-ton satellite today.
Fair, that's true. It is indeed true. The fact is that if you want to make international comparisons, tons is everything you have. The point you are raising is, do we have major differences in the technology we're rolling out? So we have looked at that closely. We see that the technology rolled out by the US DoD satellites, of course, is top of the class. But now we are considering that there is no major gap between the technology that the Chinese, the Europeans, the Japanese are actually using. So indeed, using those tonnage indicators, at least they provide a sensible measure, more sensible than actually making those bad translation of non-existing budget information in dollars. But it is dissatisfying. I wish I could do better. Actually, we do better. I'm not showing everything in the facts and figures, but we have an economic model which we are perfecting a little bit every year, so that we try to actually use technical intensity of satellites, looking at what was the country of production, what was the type of application, what was the global satellite size, and what was the customer. So we are not putting the same value for a satellite which is sold to the Argentina Ministry of Defense has the same technical intensity that you are supposed to find in a satellite which will be sold to the US DoD. So we use a number of factors. This is something we're not going live with yet, but we are perfecting this. And indeed, this creates some differences in assessment. Also, as I mentioned, human flights, you have those very big, heavy capsules, but the technological intensity is completely different than what you would see in actually software-defined radio, high throughput satellite, etc. So clearly we acknowledge this. On the other hand, I am challenging one statement, which I see many, many times on Twitter. The performance of satellites has not improved by a factor 10 in the last few years. It has not improved by a factor 100 in the last few years. This is not true. And when you look, for instance, at the performance that Planet is achieving with the Doves, indeed it's good. It is exciting. They have 300 now in orbit, but clearly the technical intensity, the technological quality of those satellites actually does not compare to what you get today with Pléiades, Pléiades Neo, and the Search, or even what you can get with SI, which is SAR, of course, so it's different. But clearly we have different models there. But at some point, if you have a very small satellite, it will have a small value. I don't see a 1 kilo satellite costing $100 million. So in the end, the mass indicator is not so bad to get a good feeling of the business. Again, I'm not saying it's perfect, far from it, but it's not bad. Actually, if you still start segmenting, and you look at special segment, small satellites in telecom, small satellites in etc., it makes a lot of sense, and it unveils many, many things that the global space economy figures are not telling you.
Okay, I would only add that in Russia particularly, and this is maybe why you and Mr. Breton have a bit of an argument. Breton saying Europe is number 2, that's a stretch. I think we can agree. But Russia, until fairly recently, was launching 2 satellites for every 15 years, when a European satellite or a US satellite or a Japanese satellite would last that 15 years. So they're launching more tonnage for no more quality.
Yes, but on the other hand, what I note as well is that the launch capacity of Russia is absolutely immense compared to the European one. So we definitely are much better than that. And then that Thales Alenia Space is making for years now all the payloads for the Express program, the Horizon, and the RSCC. So clearly we have an advantage in terms of technology and quality over Russia when you look at spacecraft. Of course, they have old-fashioned launchers, but the capacity which they are able to roll out is still pretty much ahead of what we have. So you see, it's very difficult to have one single indicator. But clearly, I think it's not okay to say we are number 2. Okay, we may be number 3 just because we are better than Russians at building satellites. But that can be debated a lot.
Fair enough. Okay, thanks.
You're welcome. Other questions? Pascal?
Yes, a question regarding, you mentioned the constellation potential, so to say. For you, what could be the best option, which is currently studied by the European Commission? How many satellites would be good enough for the European space industry? Do you have already such figures? And
no, I don't want to answer that question because I don't have this information from the facts and figures. So I would like to focus on the data we have, which is the data from the past. And but one thing I wanted to note is that if there were, let's say, 2 billion more in the European space budget, and if that money would go against an operational system that would have recurrent business for the industry, in the end, the European space sector would have more business for both satellites and launch activity, and that would be a good point. So you see, that's the typical lobbying message. Give me more money, I will give better things to you. But again, we need to understand at some point in time, and this is something which I'm strongly convinced about, is that there is a kind of critical mass to be achieved when you have a big launcher, a medium launcher, and soon a few micro launchers on your territory. If you don't give them sufficient business, they will never be efficient enough. Because this is a feature of launcher economics. A good launcher is a launcher which is not grounded too much. So it must be technically robust. And this is just a nod at Peter's remarks before. Of course, you must have a robust launcher, technically speaking. But if it doesn't launch enough, it is difficult to keep it robust, difficult and expensive. So in the end, I believe that there is a critical mass to be achieved. And we see the Russians are launching often. Their satellites may not be that good, but that keeps the industry alive and it keeps the sector rolling. So I have the impression in Europe that we have ambitions which are a tad below the industry we have built. Now we need to take advantage of all this. That, of course, is a strong lobbying message and maybe a bit entendu. But I think it's important to understand because it wouldn't cost that much. And when you start looking at the global effort, which is done by the US, the Chinese, and the Russians, I think it would make sense that we step it up a little bit in Europe. There's a hand raised, but I don't see who. Please introduce yourself. It's DigiDefis. Mr. Defis C.
Yeah, sorry, I'm Christophe Morin from
Hello,
DigiDefis. Just a question. There is always this discussion on a new space and what is the weight of space in your figures, and notably you have stated a lot of examples. In fact, the Europe is producing, I would say, more big satellites, those kind of approach. Have you any kind of metrics to compare, in fact, the nature of the production of those satellites within Europe compared to the US and to Russia and China, if you consider only the fourth key player? What is the share of, in fact, the production of big satellites and the share of, I would say, small satellites?
Well, it's an interesting question. So I don't have exact metrics right now, but we keep a tab on every single satellite which is launched, and we keep a tab on who is actually building it and who is actually paying for the satellite and who is actually launching it. Today, the new space, the problem is that it's still PowerPoint companies. I'm not saying this as a bad word. It's because they are building up capability. So for instance, I am tracking the new space environment. In 2019, in Europe, new space employment was in the order of 500 to 600 people. In 2020, it is up to 1,500 people. So you see, it has tripled. But when you start looking at the actual output in terms of satellites, most of the companies there, and I have listed the 250 European startups in space infrastructure only. I'm not counting anything from the downstream. I'm tracking only the infrastructure companies because that's my job. If you look at those companies, most of them are still in infancy. Only a few have actually deployed initial capability. I would like to mention ISI, for instance. Then we have a few key players in Europe because they seem to be the reference players for actually providing nano satellites for demonstration feeds for the whole new space in the world. Clyde, or AAC Clyde, GomSpace, NanoAvionics, EasySpace. Those companies are producing 6, 7, 8, 10 CubeSats, and sometimes even more, every year. Of course, if you look at the global scale, those are rather small companies. They represent altogether 200 people. So you compare that to the industrial capability of even OHB. OHB is 3,000 people, and they have the capacity to do much more. So you see, the problem with the new space is that, one, there is only one big new space player and a medium one, which has actually deployed a lot of satellite. It's Starlink and OneWeb. So this is a reality, and it's clouding everything. If you look at that dimension, the rest of the new space is almost non-existent. Then you have Planet and Spire, which has deployed large numbers of very small satellites built in-house. And again, those are pretty unique still at this point. There's not much than that. And then we have a number of few players here and there, which are starting deploying. Capella Space, ISI, Black Sky, etc., etc. We need to see how it ramps up, and this will take 2-3 years before we can actually make an economic assessment of all this. But one information I would like to pass is the following. There is a big difference in the new space between the very big impact in terms of equity leverage, such as SpaceX, Blue Origin, and OneWeb, and now the 10 SPACs we have in space, which are actually leveraging huge amounts of money. Then we have the other dimension, which is the dimension we have also in Europe. We have a number of space players in the infrastructure development domain. And there, I tell you one thing, which I believe is important to keep in mind. I don't see any major difference or lagging behind between the Europeans and the Americans. I am not sufficiently informed of the Chinese new space. I believe it's a bit difficult to understand, so I cannot vouch for that. But I can really tell you, if you start looking company by company, Europe is not very far behind the United States, but we don't have SpaceX. We don't have Blue Origin, okay? So this is a fact. But for the new space part, we need to see 3 years from now how those companies are faring. We have a few very good players in Europe, but we also have to accept that for the time being, those players are really small. And you know, it is like comparing your local coffee shop with Starbucks. Will your local coffee shop become the new Starbucks because they have a new way of making coffee, better and maybe cheaper? And then in that case, it will take up, people will like it, and then maybe it will grow because so many people will want to buy that coffee. But today, we have the Starbucks in space, and SpaceX is part of the Starbucks in space now, and you have your local coffee shop in the form of the many new players which are emerging. We need to look into them, but still accept the fact that it's not yet a business. It's not yet even a market case. It's not yet even a product for most of them. So it's early. It's early to say it will not work. It's early to say it will work. And it's early to say they will replace the big and they will become big. Many of them, if you look at the history of GomSpace is struggling. It's a good company doing good products. They managed to sell a very small satellite in the world, but it's struggling. Financially, it is struggling. So it is very difficult to get a solid business case. And this is why I'm also questioning the real nature of the new space narrative. Is it really possible to make a satellite so cheap and at the same time so efficient that it makes you good money? So yes, please.
That's the point. In fact, there is all this narrative of new space, and today I'm missing, in fact, some figures to demonstrate, in fact, this new trend, and that's why I'm asking you if you have already some metrics just to assess the impact of the new space approach and how it will develop.
Well, we have 3 figures today that we can make. I don't have them available now, but I could count the satellites launched on behalf of the new space players so far in the past 3 or 4 years, removing the SpaceX planet effect. So that could be something that can be done, but I can tell you it's l'épaisseur du trait, as we say in France. It will be very small. We also do track the new space companies and the equity they manage to leverage, and those are metrics that we have available at Eurospace. But also, they were made available by the recent SP report number 76, I guess, with the new space in Europe. Those are good figures. Globally, they're telling you that last year, the new space companies in Europe raised 500 million, okay? And then we have something which I am tracking, which is the evolution in employment in those new space companies. And I'm telling you today that you have a vivid, thriving environment of more or less 250 companies with more or less 1,500 employees Europe-wide. So you see that's small company sizes.
Thanks.
You're welcome. I see that we have other questions. Olivier, you are showing me, what's the order for the question? I'm sorry, I cannot see my WhatsApp now.
Yes, Pierre, we have in order, we have a question from Thomas Malinauskas, and then from Michal Spieczovic from DGDFI.
Okay, please, welcome.
Good afternoon, Pierre and everyone. Thank you very much for this very interesting presentation, really fantastic presentation, very, very good content. I just would like to go back a little bit more to institutional aspects and institutional European space industry. So recently, European Commission established this EUSPA, European Commission Space Agency, as I call it. I would like to ask you, how do you see an impact of this agency, or it will be just another, I would say, bureaucratic organism which will just collaborate with ESA, or there will be some kind of split of budgets and split of I would say activities? We already see now that Thierry Breton is talking about this Space Launcher Alliance, and then which is, I think, a little bit in competition with what ESA is thinking. So I would like to get your view and maybe opinion about this. Thank you.
Well, it's a bit out of scope, if I may say so, but I don't want to avoid the question. Still, I would like to highlight one point, is that the EUSPA, from what I understand, but Olivier will be able to elaborate a bit more because he is the policy expert in Eurospace, not myself, I'm the economist. And but the EUSPA is nothing more than the GSA, which has been rebranded. So, you know, we are changing a little bit the perimeter. The GSA was only looking at Galileo. Now it will also handle other programs. And so they decided to change the name. So I don't see this as an impact. From the budget point of view, we see that this is a management agency, which is actually getting a budget delegation, and it is entrusted by the Commission to manage this budget in many ways. And I don't want to go into that right now, but we should just understand that there is sometimes some competition on who is actually the real entity managing the budget. So in some cases, the EU as a political entity is giving the EUSPA the budget, and the EUSPA maybe then entrusts ESA for the technical and contractual management of that same budget. So we have 3 layers. And in some cases, I believe that ESA thinks it would be better to have only 2 layers and to skip completely the EUSPA. So, but maybe, Olivier, you want to add a comment on that, but that's beyond the topic of the day.
Yeah, indeed, but that the situation might have been considered a bit complicated a few weeks ago, but now the 2 institutions have signed this FFPA, which is the financial framework agreement between the 3 institutions. So from an industry point of view, there is no real concern. It's governance between public institutions, and at least on the paper the things are clear. So in any case, EUSPA will only get the budget it actually receives from the EU budget for obvious reasons. So we don't really expect an impact on the economics of the sector, at least in the upstream. Let us not forget that EUSPA has also a mandate to develop the downstream sector. So, but we are not monitoring this.
So we have
Okay.
Michal Pietrovitz. Sorry, I'm maybe not pronouncing that right.
Yes, Morris, good afternoon. Can you hear me?
Yes, we do.
I'm Michal Pietrovitz from DG Defis Unit Space Policy. This is very interesting presentation. I'm really grateful for it. Gives a bit coherence regarding the situation on the market. I also tend to agree that this number of kilograms and perhaps number of launches per year provides a quite good indication on what is happening in the world within the launcher market. Even if this is not perfect, this is really useful. My question is related to keeping European launcher industry or launcher segment globally competitive middle term, long term, in terms of capacities due to scale effect. So seeing that we have much lower demand than China and US, and knowing that that scale effect provides opportunity to absorb by markets new technologies, new developments, also lowering price per kilogram, etc. Are you in a position to assess, like middle term, long term, how much percentage of US or China tonnage per year or number of launches we need to keep to give a chance to our industry to stay competitive long term in terms of technology capacities, price per kilogram, etc. Do you have this feeling? Thank you.
Well, the figure I believe is pretty well known, and not only by me. We know that if we want to have a viable economic and technical system in Europe, which includes Ariane 6 and Vega, and maybe a few micro launchers, but then again, those are not playing the same game, so it's very different to assess. But if we had 8 Ariane 6 launches a year, and if we had 4 to 5 Vega launchers per year, I believe that the system would be globally sustainable. The launch price that would be presented to institutions and commercial customers as well would be manageable. How much of that we would need to capture from the USA? Well, we perfectly know that we don't launch NASA stuff unless we have a barter agreement, such as the James Webb Telescope. But we don't launch NASA, we don't launch DoD, we don't launch anything that the Chinese institutions are building. So what's left for us? The commercial business. The fact is that now the commercial business is shifting. The commercial business was the geo-commercial, and there were between 15 and 25 satellites to be launched a year. Peter recently said, and very rightfully enough, those satellites are getting smaller. So the usual big GEO was maybe 4 tons. Now the average GEO, thanks to electric propulsion, etc., is in the order of 2.5. So clearly, the very large launchers are not as efficient as they used to be. So we need to see what is the long-term economic model. Do we still want to have a business which is actually targeting GTO launch for those types of satellites? And do we believe that this is the stable business that will provide us the recurrent activity which would be required to justify and cover the fixed cost of launch? Because what people don't understand, I believe, is that in the launch approach, there is a big amount of fixed cost. You have all the workforce, you have all the investment at the launch site, and you have all the facilities in the industry. And at some point in time, they cost you every year. Your salary you pay every year, depending on the number of flights. No, you have 6,000 people, you pay 6,000 people. If you do 8 launches, you pay 6,000 people. If you do 2 launches, you pay 6,000. So salaries are a fixed cost. And then you have a lot of infrastructure cost. The launcher is very capital intensive. So your situation is that the marginal cost of launch is not very big usually. What is costly is the amortization every year of the workforce and the fixed assets. So if you can actually get the amount of fixed assets that you need to amortize over the year, and you can cover it, and you say, okay, with the 4 first launches, maybe I'm covering my fixed assets. Then with 3 additional launches, I'm paying my workforce. Then you know that all launches after that, you are making a profit. If you are sure to cover your costs with maybe your 6 first launches, your fixed cost, then with every other additional launches, you have a good EBIT. If you have a good EBIT, you can actually cover the recurring cost of launch and make sure that in the end, every single launch is at a consistent average price. Today, in Europe, we are trying to fight with institutions to cover those fixed costs. And this is where we have a difficult dialogue, because the fixed costs are very high if you put them in context of 2 to 3 launches a year, which is the best case we can see from the institutional demand. If we were putting those fixed costs in the context of 6 launch activities a year, then there wouldn't even be a political problem. This is why it is so difficult to get this going, because at some point in time, people say, rightfully enough, this launcher is too expensive. And my answer, as an economist expert in the field, is that it's not too expensive. It's just not enough used. It's like having a bus if you're traveling with only 2 people in it. In the end, your use costs are big. Parking it is a mess. Putting it on the highway is a mess. It has a high consumption. It doesn't have good aerodynamics. If you have only 2 people to carry, maybe you don't need the bus. But today, the European program environment requires a large launcher, such as the one we are designing for Ariane 6, and a medium launcher like Vega. That's because we have the Copernicus, we have the Galileos, we have the Athena Fidus, we have the Satcom BV, we have this kind of program. So we want to have the possibility to be independent, to launch all those programs. So we need those two. We cannot do less than that. So how do we make sure that they don't cost too much? And again, it's sad to say that the obvious answer is use them more and the average cost would be less. The total cost would be the same. So I think there is some kind of a mind shift which is required at some point. Instead of fighting to make the launcher less expensive by your means, by asking industry to go to cost reduction, 2%, 3% here, etc. Let's make the innovation that makes the launcher robust, flexible, and able to absorb every new demand that comes. And this is what happens when the launcher is reusable. You can actually address additional demand like this because the launcher is ready because it is reusable. That's point one. And the point two is increase the volume of guaranteed demand. And this is not just, the usual lobbying rant that give more money to the industry. If you start looking, and it takes a few hours to understand the dynamics of launcher economics, looking at capital expenditures, looking at fixed costs, looking at amortization and depreciation, it becomes obvious. And even an expendable launcher can be cheap if it is launching enough. Let's recall that in 2001, 2002, Ariane 4 and Ariane 5 were used at the same time in Kourou. Arianespace was making the best profit it ever made because it was providing launch opportunities in huge quantities. So you see, we need to keep this in mind. Volume is the first solution if you want to address cost issues, more than anything else. Do we have other questions? David Pratt from Agoria?
Yes, thank you, Pierre. David Pratt from Agoria, the ASD department. Thanks a lot for the excellent presentation and the explanations you already gave. We're talking a lot now about the competitiveness or the lack of competitiveness of the European launchers. That's quite an urgent issue, I think, to tackle. So I'm wondering if you already have some ideas, and if I say ideas, I know that maybe you have some figures or data about the evolution and the number of European satellites, so built by European industry, but that are launched by non-European launchers. So is there some data about that? And I'm not talking about the bigger satellites like the ones that are built by OHB, Thales Alenia Space or Airbus, but there are some smaller satellites built by European industry, maybe also more in the new space domain, and that are launched elsewhere or with other launchers than European ones. So do we have figures about that? Because I guess that can also be a good trend to analyze, just to see if the European launchers are still covering that aspects and eventually capable of capturing these markets. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. I don't have this information right now to share with you, but at the beginning of August, I'm ready to make a call with you if you're there, or later on to go in, because we have those figures in our database. I would like to recall one thing. Everybody was talking about the Transporter 1 and Transporter 2 mission of SpaceX. And then everybody made, a big fuss about it was a PSLV launch that deployed, the largest number of CubeSats ever put in space, and it was 104. Okay, well, Vega is doing exactly the same. Vega is doing exactly the same. So how many of those would be European and how many of those would not be? I don't have this information at hand. But what I'm saying is that there is no major significant difference between all those launch systems. It's not inherent, it's not this one is good in absolute and this one is horrible in absolute. There is a problem of actually having the correct launcher economics in place. So launching very small satellites is a good opportunistic business for medium and small launchers. It is not a very good business for large launchers. I'm taking again the example of the Transporter 1 mission. I made all my tiny calculations. It deployed a total of 14 tons in orbit, okay? But of that, there were only maybe 8 million paid if I take the $5,000 per kilo, which is the advertised price, at best, the paid customers, they only paid 8 million in total to fly Transporter 1. All the rest was Starlink. So it's a free launch for Starlink, or it's a non-cost launch for Starlink, but still, it's not a good business. It is not a good business if you are very low price. And this is, again, a very key point of launcher economics. If you start putting down the launch price, then the value of launch goes down mechanically. So the launcher market, global value, we see it is decreasing despite the fact that the mass in launch is not changing. This is because there is a pressure on price. And then I would like to raise another typical economist question, because it's been a question that we, looking at the launcher economics, have been asking ourselves many, many times. Is there price elasticity for launch services? This means, are you going to buy more launch if the price of launch goes down? We have seen in the past 10 years a reduction of launch price globally, okay, from the various offerings in the order of, I would say, 25 to 30%. That was the global price reduction, mostly driven by SpaceX. And I don't see the demand growing significantly. We do see indeed so many new players coming up and say, okay, I'm going to launch 60 satellites, but every satellite is 10 kilograms. So basically these guys are launching 60 per 10. That's 600 kilograms launched. What are you doing with 600 kilograms launched? This is creating the opportunity for one launch of, how is it called? From RFA, for instance, or ISAR. One, not 200, it's one. So clearly, even if you look at the budding environment of all those new space companies, something must strike you is that if they all propose to deploy very small satellites, even in very large quantities, if those don't reach the quantities which are measured in thousands and thousands and thousands, which will be the case with Starlink, Kuiper, and Lightspeed, if you don't reach those figures, this is not a good, interesting market, even if you have 10, 20, 30 of those companies, because that would create opportunity for 1 ton launched here for the deployment of a full-scale constellation, and then maybe 600 kilograms there, and maybe that much the next year. But it's not changing the dynamics of the launch market. At least that's not the way I see it, because clearly it's like DHL versus Maersk. You know, if you can fill up a container, you need to wait until it is filled up. This is the, how is it called? And you know, this company which is making so much advertising on Instagram, Wish. So you make the order, and then, you know, until the container is not full, they're not shipping it. So my son is still waiting. It's been 18 months now. He ordered, you know, a rucksack on Wish. You see? So we need to understand this economic. Launcher is all about volume, destinations, and flexibility. Yeah, I would like to thank you all very much for participating here. Also, thank you very much for the nice messages in the chat. I'm looking at them. I appreciate that very, very much. And so just a piece of information. This presentation will be available from our website. This information is okay to use in the press with appropriate quotation. This information is okay to use in the public because it is public information on the website. And the ones from the institutions and the press will also receive, by the end of the day, the full report, which should be treated with confidentiality. It is not a public document. So thank you very much for being here. Olivier, maybe you want to say bye-bye if your connection is still good enough.
Yes.
Thank you, Pierre.
If WebEx stops rejecting me every time I take the floor, indeed. So thank you to all participants, and I wish you a good weekend, and for the luckiest among you, perhaps already a good summer break. So thank you again, Pierre, for this very clear presentation.
Thank you, guys.
See you
Thank
soon.
you, guys.
Thank you.